Good morning. Let's try it again. Come on. Good morning. It's great to see all of you here. And we've been waiting for this for a year. And I'm really, really glad that the time has arrived. And so I'd like to welcome all of you to the 40th Brown Symposium at Southwestern University. The Brown Symposium was established in 1977, and it is funded through the endowment from the Brown Foundation for named faculty chairs. Its purpose is to enhance the scholarly work of the faculty and to enrich all of our scholarly conversations here at Southwestern. The Brown Symposium has become one of our most anticipated events, and after having to delay it a year, that certainly has never been more true. Each symposium offers a unique theme related to the research interests of the organizers. I'd like to acknowledge and to thank all of our current and retired Brown chairholders who have developed incredible symposia that have been fascinating and also have captured students' interests over the years. This year's Brown Symposium organizers are Professor Faye Geraci, Professor of Psychology and holder of the John H. Duncan Chair, and Dr. Ben Pierce, Professor of Biology and holder of the Lillian Nelson Pratt Chair. Professor Geraci is a leading expert in the field of behavioral neuroscience who has studied how drugs of abuse affect sexual motivation in the female rat. She's been doing this work now for over 2 decades. She's passionate about collaborating with students, and she has co-authored approximately 25 of her 50 peer-reviewed scientific articles with students since joining the faculty in 2003. Professor Ben Pierce teaches and conducts research in the areas of genetics, evolution, and the biology of amphibians. He's authored 44 research articles in peer-reviewed journals and published 4 books, including Genetics, a Conceptual Approach, a genetics textbook that is now in its 7th edition. This year's theme, Attraction, the Science and Art of Sex and Romance, represents the shared interests of these 2 extraordinary professors. They've invited 5 notable speakers, known both nationally and internationally for their expertise, to join us today to discuss attraction from their diverse scientific and cultural perspectives and interests, which include evolutionary psychology, social psychology, sexual selection, fashion, and art. Truly paideia. On behalf of the faculty, students, staff, trustees, alumni, and friends of Southwestern University, I'm very, very glad that you have joined us today, and please welcome our esteemed professors. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to those of you here at the Alma Thomas Theater, as well as to those of you who are joining us in the live stream. We really appreciate you sitting at your computer for yet another Zoom meeting. We do hope that this Zoom is a little more fun than most. First, we'd like to thank you for your patience and flexibility with all of our last-minute schedule changes. Despite the changes, you all showed up, and for that, we're so grateful. As many of you know, the symposium was originally scheduled for February 2021, but because of COVID, we decided to delay the symposium a year, assuming that we would be back to normal by now. Unfortunately, COVID didn't cooperate. Viruses often change and evolve in ways that are at odds with what we want or need. The fact that evolution often takes a path that is not in our best interest is one of the themes that we're going to hear about today during this symposium on attraction.
For the past 40 years, the Brown Symposium has been led and organized by the holders of the Brown Chairs at Southwestern University. And traditionally, one Brown chair holder led the Brown Symposium, selected the topic, chose the speakers, and organized the event. This is the first year that we've had a Brown Symposium that's been co-hosted by 2 different chair holders in different fields. this symposium, Attraction, the Science and Art of Sex and Romance, has been organized by myself and my good friend and colleague, Faye Garachi. As President Tromley said, I'm a biologist who studies evolution, ecology, and genetics of amphibians. Faye is a psychologist, a neuroscientist who studies mating behavior. And this symposium really, the topic of it really falls at the intersection of our shared interest in evolution and behavior. When I teach evolutionary biology, which I'm doing this semester, I often talk with my students about two different approaches to asking a question of why a trait like attraction exists. One approach, termed proximate causation, looks at the immediate cause of the trait. What are the anatomical and social and physiological factors that elicit the particular trait? The other approach, termed ultimate causation, looks at the evolution trait. Why has this trait evolved? These two approaches, proximate causation and ultimate causation, neither one is better than the other. Rather, they're synergistic, and they really complement one another. And so in this symposium, you're going to be hearing about proximate causes of attraction. What are the neurological, anatomical, social, cultural factors that affect attraction? And you're also going to be hearing some about ultimate causation. What are the evolutionary forces that have shaped evolution in the past and continue, or shape behavior, attraction, and continue to shape it today? In 1875, 151 years ago, Charles Darwin wrote his second most influential book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And in that book, he made two important points. The first was that humans, like all other organisms, are subject to evolution and to natural selection. The second point he made was that there are certain traits that evolve not because they increase survivorship. Indeed, they may be detrimental to survival, but they evolve because they provide a mating advantage. Darwin called this sexual selection, and he recognized that it can take two forms. First of all, there's what we call intrasexual selection. That's where members of one sex compete among themselves for members of the opposite sex. Darwin saw this mainly as male-male competition, males competing among other males for available females. And he hypothesized that it led to the evolution of some exaggerated traits like the antlers that we see in deer. The other form of sexual selection is what we call intersexual selection. It involves individuals of one sex preferentially selecting members of the opposite sex based upon their traits. And Darwin saw this mainly as female choice, females actively selecting males that have certain traits, like the beautiful tail of the peacock. Today, we recognize that the situation is really more complex than this. We not only have male-male competition, we also have female-female competition, and we not only have female choice, but males can also be choosy. So Darwin didn't get everything completely right, and he had some blind spots, but nevertheless, he set the theoretical framework for our understanding of how a trait like attraction evolves.
So today we're going to hear from 5 outstanding scholars about the proximate and ultimate causes of attraction. Lisa Diamond will start us off by talking about genes, gender, desire, and behavior. She will discuss why some of us are sexually attracted to certain genders, but not others. Her talk will help us better understand why gender matters. Michael Ryan will follow Lisa. In his talk, A Taste for the Beautiful, Michael will discuss Darwin's theory of sexual selection. He will talk about what Darwin proposed and what Darwin was unable to explain, specifically why individuals have certain tastes for the beautiful. He will share with us some new studies designed to unearth the behavioral, neural, and cognitive mechanisms that shape preference. After lunch, we'll hear from 3 scholars who will present their talks virtually. Amy Muse will talk about keeping the spark alive, self-expansion in relationships. Based on her research, Amy will tell us how we can maintain our romantic relationships across time, how we can keep the sexual spark from dimming over the course of a relationship. Amy will specifically discuss her research on self-expansion, which involves novelty, challenge, and broadening perspectives as a key to maintaining sexual desire and sexual satisfaction. David Buss will follow Amy. His talk will focus on sexual conflict, deception, persistence, coercion, and force in human social systems. David will highlight what is known and unknown about the evolutionary psychology of sexual conflict and offer tentative suggestions for reducing sexual conflict in our society. And then Valerie Steele will wrap up our symposium by taking us on a fascinating journey through time to look at the role of fashion in sexual attraction. After Valerie's presentation, if you are able, we encourage you to attend an exotic art exhibit that's being co-hosted by the Brown Symposium and the Seraphim School of Fine Arts, entitled Plush. This art exhibit is curated by Ron Geibel and organized by Seth Dalton. It will take place from 5:15 to 6:15 in the Fine Arts Gallery here on campus. This was just a brief preview of what we have planned for this year's Brown Symposium. At the end of the day, we really hope that you have a better understanding and appreciation of attraction. Is that it? We just want to remind you to turn off your cell phones right now in case they're still on. We will now hear from our first speaker, Dr. Lisa Diamond. And our very own, Dr. Tracy Giuliano, professor of psychology, will introduce Dr. Diamond.
Good morning. I'm delighted and honored to introduce Dr. Lisa Diamond to you today. Dr. Diamond, a self-described feminist scientist, feels strongly about using quantitative methods in psychology in feminist ways. She was initially inspired in that direction when renowned feminist Betty Friedan gave a talk at her high school, and as she put it, a light bulb went off. Dr. Diamond has spent most of her long and illustrious career at the University of Utah, where she's a professor of psychology and gender studies. She's received numerous federal grants for her research, which focuses on sexuality, gender, and intimate relationships and their implications for health and well-being. Before starting at Utah, she earned her BA in psychology from the University of Chicago and her PhD in human development at Cornell. Dr. Diamond has published over 130 articles and book chapters and has presented her work at over 140 national and international universities and conferences. She's won numerous awards for her teaching and research, including multiple awards for Best Theoretical Article and Distinguished Book. Reflecting her standing in the field, she is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and serves on the editorial board of several top journals in our field. Dr. Diamond, however, is most famous for her groundbreaking research on female sexuality. Her 2008 book, Sexual Fluidity: Understanding Women's Love and Desire, attracted a lot of attention in the media as well as in academic psychology and other fields. It also had a big impact on me, not only as a young psychological researcher, but also as someone who had recently switched teams to marry my wife, Abby, after being married to a man for 14 years. Essentially, her 10-year longitudinal study of female sexuality revealed that women's sexual orientation is fluid and variable and can shift over time, like mine did. Today, she'll be talking to us about gender, genes, desire, and behavior, new perspectives on old questions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Diamond.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Okay, so I'm going to assume that if I just click, oh, look, it's magic. It works. Does it work? It might work. Yes, it works. Oh my God, you never know. You never know. It's a real delight to be here. It's, really rare to have an opportunity to have such an interdisciplinary discussion like this. It's one of those things that I've missed during the pandemic. And so I'm really delighted to be here. So I want to begin. Oops. I'll be patient. I see it here, but not up here. Can someone help? I see a little circle going. There we go. All right. So I want to begin with a poem. When I look at you, even a moment, no speaking is left in me, no. Tongue breaks and thin fire is racing under skin, and in eyes no sight, and drumming fills ears, and cold sweat holds me, and shaking grips me. All greener than grass I am, and dead, or almost I seem to me. And this was written by Sappho, who is, one of the kind of oldest and earliest historical lesbians, right? She lived on the Isle of Lesbos, which is apparently why we're all called lesbians now. And one of the things that I think is really instructive in terms of beginning to talk about this topic is this understanding that when we talk about something like desire and attraction, if you look at the historical record, you see evidence that this has been a part of the human condition as long as we have recorded anything. We see people expressing desire and love. And so as early as you find people expressing any desire, you see some people expressing what we would now call same gender desire. And so I want now to rocket you to the present and give you a little bit more poetry from my colleague, Catherine Stockton, who just published a fantastic book that I recommend assigning to any of your gender studies classes. It's sort of a general book that's trying to introduce the complexity, the cultural and biological complexity of gender. And Catherine is, a fellow lesbian. And one of the things that she writes in this book that is actually something that she wrote in her memoir, when she's talking about her own partner of 30 years who that she sort of like brought out of the closet. They like met, and this woman who'd been like a Mormon, college student, left her heterosexual life and got involved with Catherine. And Catherine reflects a lot in her book on what it means to call something a same gender relationship. And she says, I am not my girlfriend. We are not the same. Our genitals are different. Mine are not hers, so they're not the same. We use them differently. Their use is not the same. I do things to pleasure her a man could also do. And if she closed her eyes, she might think I were he. If she always closed her eyes, she'd never know if he were me. And I love that because it really encapsulates the way that we're making a lot of assumptions when we use terms like same sex or same gender. And when we say that, oh, what is different about gay and lesbian people? They have same gender attractions. We're not all that sure what exactly, we mean by that. Then I wanted to show the Valentine's card that I gave to my wife, and which it was obvious to me that we were these two dogs, and like they're both dogs, but they're not the same dog, right? And when I gave her this card, I was pretty sure that she'd know that she was the taller dog and I was the shorter dog. And it's like, are we the same? Are we different, right? What is the boundary of sameness and difference? And what do we all have in common, right? Am I, as a lesbian, am I like Sappho? Is Sappho like Catherine Stockton? Or Catherine Stockton's partner, who was straight before she met Catherine? Or like my wife, or my wife's ex-partner, Rosemary, who, is now involved with someone who was also heterosexual. And so, it's like, are we the same type of people, right? Do we have the same trait? And what is the boundary between these different manifestations of same gender desire and same gender behavior? and the ever proliferating categories that we see these days: lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, genderqueer. And it raises this question of what is this trait of same-gender sexuality, and does it have a biological basis? And of course, we have to give a nod to Michel Foucault, who has been prompting us to ask ourselves hard questions about why we think people come in types, and what is this sort of cultural and historical basis for kind of fetishizing human types. And so I want to begin by saying, like, well, what exactly are we trying to explain? And the distinction between sexual desire and sexual behavior, right? Because sexuality more broadly obviously takes a lot of diverse forms. It can be partnered, it can be unpartnered. Humans, one of the things that makes humans evolutionarily distinct is how much non-reproductive sexuality we have. And that's something that's also true of our closest primate relatives, like the bonobos. Sex isn't just about reproduction. With our large social brains, sex is about a lot of different things. When you think about sort of human sexuality in the broad sweep of history, historically, cultures have mainly focused on regulating behavior. You know, lots of societies are very interested in making sure that they know which babies come from which individuals. And so there's a lot of regulation of sexual behavior. And for clear-cut kind of purposes, marriage and children. And historically, sex outside of the context of reproduction wasn't considered to be that big of a deal. It was kind of like snacking between meals. And so people talk about, like, oh, the Greeks had, same-sex sexuality. It's like, yeah, because everyone assumed that you had you had marriage and children, and then you had a lot of other sex, and nobody was really worried about it as long as you continued to, get married and have children. And actually, it was not necessarily sex with the same gender that raised a lot of alarm historically, but sex across the boundaries of race and class. That has actually been considered far more taboo historically and cross-culturally than same-gender desire. And so we've had a sort of complicated relationship with what is normal and what is abnormal. And so when it comes to this question of sort of the trait, the evolution of this trait, you see debates in the field of sexuality over whether this is a trait or whether, like, something that is an inborn predisposition, or whether it's a preference, right? Is it like, is being attracted to the same gender analogous to eye color, or is it more like your preference for a certain type of ice cream? And the other thing that sort of gets complicated is that when you find individuals who say, oh, I didn't know that I was attracted to the same gender until, I was 30 or 40, or I met the right person. And in our culture, we look at those stories and we say, well, that can't be possible, right? Because if it's a trait, it's got to have been all there all along. And the analogy I like to use is like chocoholics, right? You hear a lot of people describe themselves as a chocoholic, as if it's like, oh my God, definitely, like, I respond to chocolate really strongly. And I'm thinking, like, we didn't always have chocolate bars. There's a certain historical moment where we figured out how to process chocolate and make it available. Was it possible to be a chocoholic before you ever encountered chocolate? Like, are you a latent chocoholic if you've never had a chocolate bar? And so how do you know who has this trait of same-gender desire and who doesn't? You can look at behavior as an example, like who is involved with same-gender partners and who isn't. But of course, behavior is pretty complicated, which is why societies love to regulate it. And people have a lot of different reasons for engaging in sexual behavior, right? Maybe you have sex with your partner because you find your partner sexually desirable. Maybe your partner has sex with you because they find your money desirable, or your best friend, or your HBO subscription, right? There's a lot of different reasons that people engage in behavior, and behavior is not always a good marker of motivation. Then there's the even trickier question of gender. We're so obsessed with sexual orientation as a gender-based construct, right? Like, are you attracted to this gender, that gender, or the other? And we don't spend nearly as much time thinking about desires that focus on other important social categories like income, race, ethnicity, religion, body size, physical ability. We never talk about whether certain people are born attracted to rich people or born attracted to Lutherans, right, or Iranians. We assume that, based on Darwin, of course, we assume that gender has a primary organizing kind of influence on our desires that is distinct from other traits. And yet, this is fraught as well, because if you think of like the human experience, we have no sense of gender without race in particular. And one of the arguments that Stockton makes in her book, which I think is, you know, really took me aback and took me for a whirl, was that at least in America, we've always had 6 genders, not 2. White woman, white man, black woman, black man, Native woman, Native man. That you really can't think about gender without overlaying it with other intersectional sort of social categories, right? And there is a huge debate raging right now on dating sites like OkCupid about whether it's permissible to express a racial preference and to say, I only want to see matches of a certain race. And so OkCupid has been really radical. You can have as many like gender identities as you want. But as the algorithm kind of gives people one race over another based on their preferences, it's become really, really clear that for some people, racial preferences are stronger than gender preferences. And that gets really controversial. And OkCupid periodically does surveys to its participants saying, do you think it's wrong to express a racial preference? So it's clear that as a company, they're like, we are getting into some scary territory here because we don't want to be racist, but people's preferences seem to be a little bit racist, right? So again, we treat race and gender as different types of categories. And we don't, you know, and here's another sort of example. This is a hypothetical thing, but I hear this kind of thing all the time. My son went to college, joined the Queer Student Alliance, and now he has a boyfriend. How do I know whether he's really gay or whether this is something experimental or political, right? In other words, is he just experimenting or does he have a same gender orientation? And yet we don't hear things like this. My son went to college, joined the Black Lives Matter student group, and now he has a black girlfriend. How do I know whether he's really in love with her or whether this is something experimental or political, right? Does he have an other race orientation? You can see how we make totally different assumptions when it comes to race and other categories than we do with regard to gender. And that affects everything about what we think about sexual orientation. We can't even think about sexual orientation without thinking about gender. It's all about, you know, same gender, other gender, both genders, multiple genders, right? It's all about gender, and they all take the gender binary for granted, right? There's two genders, so there's 2 types of sex, with the same and with the other. And the problem, of course, is that the gender binary is breaking down in the face of advanced biology and also a broader cultural understanding of its manifestations. The kind of old view that was still pretty prevalent when I started doing research in the early 90s was that everyone has a biological sex and then everyone has a gender. And gender is the social part of your, you know, of sex and gender, and sex is the biological part. And so therefore you can have a gender that concords with your biological sex, and we would call that cisgender, or you could have a gender that differs from your biological sex, and we would call that trans or non-binary or genderqueer. The problem, and you still see this in a lot of textbooks. I review a lot of textbooks on gender, and they're all like biological sex. And I'm like, really? Really? Do you want to think about that a little bit more? Because we don't have, none of us have a single biological sex. We actually have 5. We have, you know, there's sort of 5 layers of sexual differentiation. You've got chromosomes, which code for the fetal gonads. The fetal gonads pump out hormones, so you have fetal organizational hormone exposure. Then you have the development of the internal reproductive anatomy, and then you have the external genitalia. And then after puberty, you get a 6th layer, which is secondary sexual characteristics that are related to hormones like breasts and musculature and Adam's apples and things like that. So because the Olympics are happening right now, I figured it'd be good to use an Olympic metaphor, that you can imagine that these different layers of biological sexual differentiation are like the Olympic rings. And you can look at any two layers and you can kind of look at them as having a certain degree of overlap with one another. And in some cases, the overlap is perfect. And in some cases, the overlap is not that great because of a range of things. It's not only kind of endocrine disorders that cause a lack of overlap. There's a huge range of natural variation in all of those layers of sexual differentiation. And so you can imagine that if you put them all on top of each other, you've got your chromosomal status, you've got your fetal gonads, you've got your fetal hormones, then your internal reproductive anatomy, then your external genitalia, and eventually you have your post-pubertal physical characteristics. And when they all kind of align together, you can say, okay, that's your biological sex. It's the sort of fulcrum of all these different things. And yet, and if they lean in the kind of ovary, uterus direction, it's a girl. If it's a sperm producer, it's a boy. And the problem is that when we make that assignment at birth, and that's why the term that I use instead of biological sex is birth assigned sex, we make that determination on the basis of one layer and one layer only, the presence of the penis. Is it a penis or it is a vagina? And we assume that if you've got a penis, you've got all those other things that line up in the same way. And in most cases, that's roughly true. But we don't ever actually know. In most cases, you don't ever actually dive into and examine the other layers of sex unless there's some sort of problem or some sort of condition. We don't even do regular chromosomal testing on kids. And so we're inferring something that doesn't really exist. It's the classic latent variable in terms of structural equation modeling. And there are plenty of cases that we now understand in which those layers don't actually line up together all that well. And in that case, you could say, well, is that still a boy? Like, at what point do you cross over from like boy to non-binary to something else? And you can imagine that all of us have our own particular constellation of these 6 different layers of sexual differentiation. We all have, 6 different genders going on. And so then you can look at them and say, well, then what exactly counts as a same gender relationship versus an other gender relationship? Is that a same gender relationship? Is that an opposite gender relationship? And we never actually have to make this determination because society solves this for us. It tells us who is who. These are the girls, these are the boys, so that you know who is who. But yet again, that determination is based on one layer that's present at birth. And we take a sort of unquestioning approach to that categorization. So I like to think about the terms same gender and other gender as kind of heuristics, as mental shortcuts. They are easy ways to clump the word, to group individuals into meaningful categories. But the categories themselves are sort of fraught. And it's very similar to the way we think about race. We know that, now that we've mapped the human genome, we know that calling somebody Black is not a genetically meaningful statement at all. And most of us who are, running our own genes through 23andMe are finding out that we're 20% this and 20% that and 1% this. So what's your true ethnicity, right? What's your category? We're all kind of multi-categorical. But we do know one thing, which is that same gender sexual behavior and same gender sexual desire are not culturally approved, right? So even though at a biological level they're fraught constructs, they retain a powerful cultural meaning that we have to account for and then try to understand what is it that would drive someone to engage in a behavior that is so socially stigmatized that in some parts of the world it can get you killed, right? So that must be a pretty strong motivation. What is it about? And are all the people who engage in that behavior, are they all part of the same group? do they have something in population in common? And at a population level, are the people engaging in same gender behavior genetically distinct as a population than individuals who don't? And are there differences within that population, right? This goes back to the question I began with. Is the person who's been a lesbian their whole life different in some fundamental way than someone who is bisexual, or someone who only came out late in life and has only had one partner, one same gender partner? Are those different types of queer people? Are they all the same type of queer people? Are bisexuals more genetically similar to heterosexuals? Are they more genetically similar to lesbians? And this goes to that question of whether we have a genetic essence, right? Are we born some sexual way? And this, of course, is a long-standing question. You know, back in 1992, this was one of the covers of Newsweek magazine, "Is this child gay?" And it was talking about the research of Dean Hamer, which was looking for a specific genetic marker that was associated with same-gender sexuality. And there's been a lot of research on the heritability of same-gender sexual expression. Some of it's based on twin studies. Some of it, and I'm going to talk about this study in a little bit, is based on full genome-wide scans, where you just look at every single gene in a human and see whether there are certain polymorphisms called SNPs that are more strongly associated with a certain trait than others. The heritability of any trait ranges from 0 to 1. And 1 would mean that all of the person-to-person variance in a population is due to genetic differences. And 0 would mean that none of the population variance is due to genetic differences. So heritability is always about populations, not about individuals. I think a common misunderstanding of heritability is that if something is a heritability of 0.5, it means that in you, half of that is, you know, genetic and half is environmental. And that's a meaningless statement, because heritability is always about populations. It's never about individuals. So when it comes to same-gender behavior and same-gender sexual expression, most of the twin studies and the genome-wide studies agree. They have a pretty consistent finding, which is that the heritability is about 0.32, so about a third. And so that means that in an average population, like 30% of the person-to-person variability in sexual behavior, in same-gender sexual behavior, is attributable to genetic influence. Now, that is significantly greater than 0. That is evidence for a significant genetic contribution. What often goes unnoticed, however, is that's not as big as some other traits that we don't often think of as being essential. Smoking has a heritability of 0.6. Personality, depending on the trait, extroversion, neuroticism, those traits have a heritability ranging between 0.45 and 0.6. And job satisfaction, that's my favorite. It has a heritability of about 0.45. And yet, you never see anyone saying things like, will this child hate their job, right? Or did you just give birth to a smoker, right? So we obsess about certain genetic influences more than we obsess about others. And certainly Darwin could not have imagined, you know, predicting job satisfaction or smoking, you know, when he was doing his research. So I want to talk a little bit about the most recent genetic study that came out, which yielded some pretty fantastic and unappreciated findings. So this was the largest genome-wide association study that's ever been done of sexual behavior and sexual orientation. They had the full genomes, right? And then again, they made very clear they were focusing on sexual behavior because it's the only thing you can really reliably measure in these things. So these were people who gave up their genes and filled out questionnaires for either the UK Biobank or 23andMe. And it had a pretty impressive sample size, 477,522 individuals. Full genomes on all of these individuals and information on their sexual behavior. 96% of the sample had never engaged in any same gender sexual behavior at all. You'll notice that sometimes I say same sex, sometimes I say same gender. I no longer believe in unitary sex, but I do believe in unitary gender because society assigns us all one. So I usually prefer same gender, but sometimes same sex is just easier to say. So 96% of these folks had never had any sort of same gender behavior at all, and 4% had. And so what the first analysis they did was just looking at whether these groups were genetically different, whether there were single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, that differentiated between these two groups. And there were 5 SNPs that were really strong, but in the overall analysis, they said it's really hundreds of genes that contribute to this. And they also made very clear that the influence of each gene was so small that there would be no way to sort of, you know, look at anyone's genome and predict who was going to engage in same gender behavior. So it's genetically influenced. It's obviously not genetically deterministic. And as I mentioned before, the heritability estimate is around 0.32. Now, then there's a complication, right? That ever group, the 4% who had ever engaged in same gender behavior, right? That has people who've had only same gender behavior, that has people who've had just one. And so you can ask, well, do they all belong in the same category? Are they the same type of people? Do they have the same trait? Are they genetically different or genetically similar to each other? And so the researchers took that ever group and they took a closer look at them because they had information about their lifetime proportion of same gender behavior. So there were some that were mostly engaging in same gender behavior through their whole lifetime, some who were mostly but not exclusively engaged in other gender behavior, and some that had more bisexual patterns of behavior. And this is how it actually kind of looked, and this graph is taken directly from their publication. So these are all the folks in the ever group, and so they took their number of same-sex partners that they'd ever had in their lifetime and divided it by their total number of partners of both genders so that you could kind of rank people according to whether they had mostly opposite sex behavior or mostly same-sex behavior or somewhere in the middle. And this is where folks, you know, kind of came out. This is that like the 20,000 participants who had same gender behavior, and they were divided into female and male. And you can kind of look at this as being sort of analogous to the famous Kinsey scale, right? Which tried to represent same gender sexuality as a continuum and not as categorical, right? And so this is the classic way the Kinsey scale is described. You go from a 0, which is exclusively straight, all the way to being exclusively gay. And then there's this wonderful rainbow continua. You know, it's like you just get more and more gay as you go up the scale. And so one of the things that these researchers were interested in was whether your placement on the scale has a genetic loading. Is that a genetic trait, whether you're a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? And so they looked at that question and they took out the Kinsey zeros and just focused on the folks with some degree of same gender behavior. And they said, is your proportion of same gender behavior genetically influenced? And the answer was yes. And they found that the heritability of person-to-person variation along that Kinsey scale was significant. It was around 0.25. So now's where things are going to get weird. And this was the thing that, like, I saw very little of the publicity in this study kind of try to tease out. So the trait of ever having same-gender sexuality versus never having same-gender sexuality, that trait had a heritability of 0.32. The trait of, like, how queer are you once you get, you know, from the Kinsey 1 to Kinsey 6 is also heritable at 0.25. And what you would think is that, right, these would be kind of the same trait. You just, like, you start out het and you get more and more gay, and it's the same genes that kind of make you more gay, right? Is there a shared group of genes that moves you along the continuum from exclusive heterosexuality to bisexuality to exclusive same-gender sexuality, as if, like, there's those hundreds of gay SNPs, and the more you have, the more gay you have, right? that would be like a genetic basis for the Kinsey scale. And, you know, I think it would look something like this, right? You could say, oh, this person has mostly yellow SNPs because they are exclusively heterosexual. And then as you go along the Kinsey scale, you have more and more of the black SNPs because you're getting more and more and more gay, right? And there's your little Kinsey score. Well, that is not what happens to be true. There turned out to be no genetic correlation between the trait of ever never and then in the ever group, the trait of like how gay you are. And this, the researchers, you know, were very kind of measured. They're like, we were surprised by this finding. And I was like, I'm surprised by that finding too, right? It doesn't seem to make sense. The genes that appear to distinguish between exclusively heterosexual people and people who have any degree of queerness are not the same genes that determine whether, once you're in the category of queer, you're a little bit queer or a lot queer. The Kinsey scale is not one continuum. And this was sort of my response. I mean, I could barely make sense of this because it was so counterintuitive. It runs against everything. We think about heterosexuality as being the opposite of exclusive homosexuality. And this study says genetically that's not true at all, not at all. So that is not really what's going on. It's more like this. You've got the exclusively heterosexual folks who have their particular genetic pattern. And then if you want to understand variation within the ever group, it's just a different set of genes. It's just a different sort of thing. So it's like the Kinsey scale doesn't go from 0 to 6. The Kinsey scale sort of is over here. These folks aren't included. We don't know what's going on with the exclusive heterosexuals. And even further, they also did some analyses to see just how genetically similar different people at different points along the Kinsey scale were. And they found that the exclusively gay or lesbian folks were extremely similar to the folks in the bisexual category. So it's a lot of shared genetic variants. When they compared them to the mostly other gender folks, they found that the correlation dropped to almost 0. And so, yeah, these folks really do sort of seem to belong in the same category, but these folks, not so much. And there's been a lot of increasing interest lately in trying to understand just what this group is. And I should point out that in most surveys, representative surveys done in the United States, in Britain, in France, and industrialized nations, and when they ask people just about their attractions, not about their behavior, but their attractions, the vast majority of individuals with any same-gender attractions at all would describe themselves as mostly but not completely heterosexual. They account for something like 75% of the same-gender attracted, population, and yet it's a group that we haven't really started to study until very recently. My colleague Rich Savin-Williams, who was also my mentor in graduate school at Cornell, published a book recently with his interviews with men who consider themselves mostly straight. And I think it's a great example of the fact that sexual fluidity, which I first started to study among women, is not a female trait. It is a human trait. And I actually gave a talk a number of years ago that said, I was wrong. Men are pretty sexually fluid too. Go figure, right? So I think some of the implications of this is, the long-standing question in all genetics and in all evolutionary ways of thinking. You've got the phenotype and you've got the genotype. There's a long pathway from genotype to phenotype. And the phenotype is what we see around us. We see people expressing their sexuality. That's what we see. We're inferring genetic influences, but we don't know a lot about whether the genetic structure of the trait matches the taxonomic structure that we have in our heads. The intuitive appeal of the Kinsey scale, I'm more gay than you, that is intuitively appealing, but it's not necessarily scientifically accurate, right? And I have this conversation all the time, like even within the gay community, this is an issue. Like my own wife said the other day, she was describing someone, she's like, oh, and he's like he's like one of those born gay types. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, you're going to say that to me in the kitchen when you know that my entire career has been trying to like trouble me? She's like, yeah, I know all that. But, you know, like one of those, like, woo, super gay. And I'm just like, oh my God. And my sister is a second grade teacher. And a 7-year-old boy in her class came up to her recently and said, like, Miss Diamond, I have a secret. And she's like, what? And he goes, I'm gay. And she's like, great, that's fabulous. And she says, you know, this kid, she called me up, she's like, this kid, he's fabulous, he's really smart, and he is flaming. He is like a 7-year-old flaming. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? And she goes, he walks around and like is like swishing, and like he is just born with it. And I said, what part of like, do you think there's a gene for swishing? Do you actually, are you trying to tell me that you think that there's a gene for, you know, she's like, oh, he's like on Project One Ray. I'm like, do you think that's genetic? No, that is a culturally modeled phenomenon. She's like, yeah, but, and I think it's just an example. Even the people that I talk to every day, if they can't help, they have trouble resisting the notion that there's sort of a groupiness to certain types of people. They just seem to have this trait. And yet, as much as we know about the complexity, the salience of the phenotype is so seductive that we can't resist its power. And yet, I think as this study showed me in particular, we are a long way from understanding that complex chain of events that goes from genotype to phenotype. And we haven't even talked about epigenetics and the fact that we now know that certain early life experiences turn on and turn off sets of genes. And there's a lot of fascinating research on rodents suggesting a lot of epigenetic influences on the SRY gene that really plays a big role in the expression of the Y chromosome. And there's a lot of directions we could go with this. You know, one of the things that I'm interested in now is the potential that flexibility in one's sexuality is potentially an evolved adaptation. That it may have played a role in, you know, the survival of the species. Alternatively, it could be just a pleiotropic artifact, you know, something that is just a side effect of something else. There's a lot of fascinating research in child development. Thinking about people as orchids versus dandelions, that some humans are born more sensitive to their environment than others, and that one of the things that early adversity might do is to make some kids more spongy, more sensitive to environmental input, because if you're in an adverse environment, you'd better be really aware of what the environment is affording you. So I think one possibility is that maybe some people are like sexual orchids. Maybe sexual fluidity is part of our evolved legacy, that we perhaps might be better off if we have a more sensitive, more environmentally flexible sexual system than others. So there's a lot of possibilities that still remain to be explored. And I'll just leave you with the notion that we still don't really know. People are like, does sexual orientation exist? I'm like, I'm not really sure. You know, I'm a lesbian, but I'm not even sure. We definitely are learning more about the complex sort of genetic and environmental influences, which is why in my own language, I've really shifted away from talking about sexual orientation or sexual minorities or LGBTQ populations. And I just talk about sexual diversity, because that's what it's really about. Diverse manifestations of desire and behavior, and it extends to gender diversity as well. You know, do we possess our genders? Do we possess our orientations? I really don't think we can answer that question. And hopefully, if I've done anything in this talk, I've made you a little unsure about what your gender and your sexual orientation is too. Thank you. Wait, is this one? Okay, so, because I want to be back in the. Michelle, oh, there we go. Michel Foucault, talked to, initially that the entire construction historically of the notion of the homosexual was through a lens of perversion. Like, oh, there are some people who are doing things that we don't think that people should do. And so queer people are lumped in with pedophiles and other kind of strange people. And so that notion that sexual deviancy is a fundamental part of it is, as old as the hills. What is sort of interesting is that you can see in the sort of historical evolution of understandings of same-gender sexuality that it's actually bisexuals who are now sort of stigmatized as being the most like promiscuous. It's like, oh, at least, especially during the same gender marriage debate, you would see these commercials that would show like really appropriate looking gay man with a baby, and they'd be like, being gay is just, we're just like everybody else. We're just paying our bills and raising our baby, and we're just like you. Like, the only thing different about us is that we, are in love with each other. We are not sexual deviants. We're quite boring married people. And then bisexuals are the ones that are stereotyped now as being like, they'll have sex with anything that moves. They'll, they can't, like, one gender is not enough. And so it just shows that historically that barometer is always shifting. We're always looking for someone to be the most different. And there was a certain point, I think, especially in the same-sex marriage debate, where, there was a lot of emphasis on, oh, we are just like you. We're just as boring. Like, we want to be boring married people just like you. And there was a lot of, feminist critique of that argument, because there were a lot of individuals who were like, the problem is that we have such strong social kind of mores around normality that we're all obsessed with figuring out who we are normal in comparison with, and throwing bisexuals under the bus and saying, well, they're the weird ones. We're just boring married lesbians is not really a social change agenda. It's basically saying we're, more normal than somebody else. Whereas, you could say the broader social change agenda is, why are we judging people's desires to begin with? And why are we categorizing certain desires as normal and other desires as abnormal? And this is heating up a lot right now, I think, because of the widespread availability of pornography to younger and younger kids. And the truth is that people are discovering kind of a lot of desires that they're not sure what to make of through exposure to pornography. So you have more and more adolescents being like, well, I saw this one image and I was turned on. Does that mean that I am a deviant, right? So I think the proliferation of more diverse sexual imagery is making more and more people have to ask themselves, what counts as a normal desire? And what's the difference between getting turned on by something and wanting to act on something. And those are, even more complicated questions. But in terms of like the natural expression of sexual diversity, diversity comes in all forms. The people who have diverse interests in terms of the gender of their partners don't necessarily always have diverse interests in terms of, like, say, BDSM or things like that. Sexual diversity takes a million forms. They don't necessarily clump together in groupings, but our society would sure like to be able to identify a single deviant group that we can say, you guys are the yucky ones, the rest of us are okay.
Awesome, thank you. Do we have any more questions? The students are here to grab them if you have them written down. Oh, but I have a hand up, okay. Yeah, come closer. You know what, if you want, come here. Yeah, come on up.
We're making you work for it.
Yeah.
It's sort of a long-winded question too. I guess that's why I was like, I can't really talk about. Anyways, so I'm interested in that genome project you were talking about earlier. And I took a really interesting social psych class with Dr. Giuliano. And one of the first things we learned was that introspection is not always reliable. And I guess I was just wondering if I'm like understanding it correctly. There was a question about the behavior, the sexual behavior, like have you ever versus like your orientation. So I'm wondering if, and I don't know, if like any like labeled straight people presented the same genes as the people who had like experienced the like, have you ever behavior.
So this is a great question, and it hits at some of the inherent kind of limitations of all the research on this. So, these scientists were limited by the data that was available in the UK Biobank and in the 23andMe. And they had behavior. They also asked them about their pattern of attraction and how they generally identified, and they gave them a scale. And one of the reasons that they ended up analyzing the data in terms of behavior, what proportion of your behavior is same gender, is that it ended up lining up pretty well, like, almost perfectly with people's self-reported attraction. So over the course of the lifespan, at least contemporarily, and this would be the big difference between now and say the 50s, most individuals who mainly want to have sex with the same gender are doing that, right? So people's behavior was generally lining up with their attractions and their expressed identity. But everybody knows that identity is a moving target. Most of the individuals who show up in studies as mostly but not completely straight, most of them, when asked, how do you identify and present yourself, will say, straight. It's just that I know I'm not completely straight. So I like to tell people that when people use the phrase LGBTQ to refer to just like the population of people, with same gender attractions, they are missing the bulk of the iceberg. The bulk of the iceberg is that huge swath of mostly but not completely heterosexual individuals who present as heterosexual, who may not, have any of their friends, they may not ever even act on it, but that is that capacity for fluidity, right? Given the right circumstance, who knows what might happen? And that's a population that, researchers have been studying sexual orientation and its origins for like, 30, 40 years. And it was really only in the last, I'd say 15 years, that they stopped excluding anyone other than exclusively lesbian and gay people from those studies. They used to be like, well, we want to understand this trait, so let's understand it in its most extreme form. That will give us the best chance at understanding it. That, I think, was the single most destructive decision in the history of like the psychology of sexual orientation, because the most common manifestation of same-gender sexuality is not exclusive lesbian and gayness. It's mostly, but not completely, heterosexuality. The population that no one was even looking at until maybe around 5 to 10 years ago. So I kind of feel like we got to roll back the clock. And then this genetic study came out, and I'm like, oh my God, like we don't know anything. We don't know anything about this trait. We just got to start over again. The Kinsey scale is so seductive, but it's like the queer is not the opposite of straight. they're just like different colors, they're just different kind of things. And I think for me, as someone who is a lesbian and someone who's been studying this my whole life, I find it to be a really exciting time to be doing this research, because I think now we have both the conceptual and kind of, scientific methodological tools to really start proving to ourselves that we don't know what we're doing.
Do we have any more questions? We have time. Oh, go ahead. You want me to come up? Okay.
I was wondering if you believe, or if there's been any research done on heritability with regards to like trends and how people come to terms with their sexuality, or how long it takes them to like come out of the closet, I guess.
I'm so glad you asked that question, and I feel like it's a natural extension. Like the next step is like, well, what about the developmental process, right? I'm also a developmental psychologist, and so I'm always thinking about how certain things unfold. And some of my earliest research was on that process in women, and how some of them, it seemed to be an early developing kind of phenomenon. Others really needed the sort of crystallization of falling in love with one person to sort of flip them over to the edge. And that we absolutely do not know, right? Because now if these studies had actually asked people for a very long sort of sexual history, we could have found out, like, when did it start? And like, was there a threshold? That is something we really don't know. And so, yeah, there's, is it possible that the time course of the unfolding of a more diverse pattern of sexual expression, is it possible that that developmental time course is genetically influenced? Absolutely. Do we have any way to understand that yet? No. And I think partly because we don't do a very good job kind of asking those questions. And I think the same question could be asked with regard to gender diversity and patterns of gender diversity and the time course through which some individuals become more or less aware of certain patterns of gender expression. So those are great questions, and the answer is, I guess, stay tuned.
We have time for one more question.
So I think it's an extension of the last question, and I'm interested in the other 68% of the variability, right? So what are the things, and I love your sponginess term, right? So like, what are the things that are accounting for the not genetic parts, and what are we studying about it? And are you an orchid or a dandelion, and what are the things that are contributing to that?
So that's a great question, right? So all behavioral genetics divides things into genes and environments, and in environments we divide things further into shared environments and unshared environments. And so like a shared environment, in a lot of these twin studies, is whether you have two twins raised in the same home by the same, parents. One of the things that we have come to understand in this whole field over the years is environment is a much broader construct than we normally think of as like human beings. We think of the environment as like, oh, where you were raised and you were raised by. Behavioral genetics, the environment is also the placenta, right? The environment is everything, all the nutrition that you're taking in through the placenta. The environment is a very broad construct. The environment is basically everything that isn't a gene. So that's a pretty broad category. The one thing we do pretty much know from behavioral genetic studies and that focus on twins and fraternal and identical twins and twins reared apart and twins reared together is that the one thing that we're pretty sure does not influence your sexuality is how you were raised by your parents. The shared environmental influence on sexuality is about nil. So we can reassure the parents of the world, you didn't do this. This has nothing to do with you. Parents always want to make it about themselves. Parents are off the hook. That, however, leads a lot of things unexplained. I have started doing a lot of research on early life experience and early life experiences of unpredictability, harshness, There are so many things that infants experience very early in life, even just the sounds they hear and the smells they have, in the same way that they begin hearing the structure of language before they can speak. And we are coming to a broader understanding of the kind of power of those early influences, and from an evolutionary perspective, from life history theory, the fact that one of the reasons that children are so sensitive to the environment is that one of the things that makes humans unique is that we have very, very long lifespans, and we don't start reproducing until relatively late, right? We have a long period of time before we need to reproduce. And survival and reproduction, we need them both, right, for the survival of the species. And as Darwin pointed out, like, reproduction is the ball game. Surviving doesn't help you much if you don't reproduce. So humans have a really particular evolutionary problem. The environment that you adapt to as a child might not be predictive of the environment you're going to face 17 years later when you're ready to reproduce. So humans are exquisitely sensitive to a number of environmental cues that can serve as indicators of, should you grow up fast and reproduce young, or can you slow down and suck up some nutrients, right? So one of the things that early adversity tends to do is to heighten babies and children's responsivity to stress, but also heighten their responsivity to nurturants. If those are the orchid kids. Those kids also tend to have earlier pubertal maturation, earlier onset of sexual activity, and greater numbers of sexual partners. And life history theory suggests that this is adaptive, right? Because if the cues that the child is getting are, the world is unpredictable and dangerous, so as soon as you get an opportunity to reproduce, just do it, because who knows what's going to happen, right? And that goes along with a sort of phenotype that's also reactive to stress and reactive to a lot of environmental input. And so one of the things that I'm trying to study right now is the degree to which these adversity exposed sort of orchid kids, whether sexual fluidity is another way of being an orchid. It's another version of openness, like, hey, the world is unpredictable, so broaden up the possibilities, because who the heck knows what's coming. And that is one potential explanation for the fact that rates of early adversity in sexually diverse populations are about twice the rates of adversity in exclusive heterosexuals. And by adversity, I don't just mean abuse, which is what people normally think of. I'm talking poverty, environmental unpredictability, violent neighborhoods, all the things that we know calibrate children's stress response system. All of those experiences are about twice as likely among queer populations. And I think that that might suggest that one of those environmental experiences is, you know, harsh environments, unpredictable environments. They may have this broadening effect on the developing sexual developmental system that we're only beginning to understand.
Thank you so much. That was awesome.